Hello Green class, it's Mrs Blake here. I have been painting and so I'm just pausing to read another chapter of our story, and I hope you've had a nice day today because it's Mother's Day, and I hope you have been treating your mummy with lots of nice treats and telling her why you love her and what's special about her. So I'll read the next chapter, and then tomorrow we're not at school, all of us, so you can use Google Classroom from tomorrow using your password, and there'll be some activities for you to do on there. Alright, so we got to this bit, and so I'll carry on. And you can join in this time. Look at where we are. So it says, "A more marred looking young one I never saw in my life," Mrs Medlock thought. Marred is a Yorkshire word and means spoiled and pettish. She had never seen a child who sat so still without doing anything, and at last she got tired of watching her and began to talk in a brisk, hard voice. "I suppose I may as well tell you something about where you are going to," she said. "Do you know anything about your uncle?" "No," said Mary. "Never heard your father or mother talk about him?" "No," said Mary, frowning. She frowned because she remembered that her father and mother had never talked to her about anything in particular. Certainly they had never told her things. "Humph," muttered Mrs Medlock, staring at her queer, unresponsive little face. She did not say any more for a few moments, and then she began again. "I suppose you might as well be told something to prepare you. You are going to a queer place." Mary said nothing at all, and Mrs Medlock looked rather discomfited by her apparent indifference, but after taking a breath she went on. "Not but that it's a grand big place in a gloomy way, and Mr Craven's proud of it in his way, and that's gloomy enough too. The house is 600 years old, and it's on the edge of the moor, and there's near 100 rooms in it, though most of them's shut up and locked, and there's pictures and fine old furniture and things that's been there for ages, and there's a big park around it, and gardens and trees with branches trailing to the ground, some of them." She paused and took another breath. "But there's something else," she ended suddenly. What could it be? Mary had begun to listen in spite of herself. It all sounded so unlike India, and anything new rather attracted her. But she didn't intend to look as if she were interested. That was one of her unhappy, disagreeable ways. So she sat still. "Well," said Mrs Medlock, "what do you think of it?" "Nothing," she answered. "I know nothing about such places." That made Mrs Medlock laugh, a short sort of laugh. She said, "But you are like an old woman. Don't you care?" "It doesn't matter," said Mary, "whether I care or not." "You're right enough there," said Mrs Medlock. "It doesn't. What you're to be kept at Misselthwaite Manor for I don't know, unless because it's the easiest. He's not going to trouble himself about you, that's sure and certain. He never troubles himself about no one." She stopped herself as if she had just remembered something in time. "He's got a crooked back," she said. That set him wrong. He was a sour young man, and got no good of all his money and big place till he was married. Mary's eyes turned towards her in spite of her intention not to seem to care. She had never thought of the hunchback's being married, and she was a trifle surprised. Mrs Medlock saw this, and as she was a talkative woman, she continued with more interest. This was one way of passing some of the time at any rate. She was a sweet, pretty thing, and he'd have walked the world over to get her a blade of grass she wanted. Nobody thought she'd marry him, but she did, and people said she married him for his money, but she didn't. She didn't, positively. When she died... Mary gave a little involuntary jump. "Oh, did she die?" she exclaimed, quite without meaning to. She had just remembered a French fairy story she had once read called Riquet à la Houppe. It had been about a poor hunchback and a beautiful princess, and it had made her suddenly sorry for Archibald Craven. "Yes, she died," Mrs Medlock answered, "and it made him stranger and queerer than ever. He cares about nobody. He won't see people. Most of the time he goes away, and when he is at Misselthwaite he shuts himself up in the west wing and won't let anyone but Pitcher see him. Pitcher's an old fellow, but he took care of him when he was a child, and he knows his ways. It sounded like something in a book, and it did not make Mary feel cheerful. A house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up and their doors locked. A house on the edge of a moor. Whatsoever a moor was, sounded dreary. A man with a crooked back who shut himself up also. She stared out of the window with her lips pinched together, and it seemed quite natural that the rain should have begun to pour down in grey slanting lines and splash and stream down the window panes. If the pretty wife had been alive, she might have made things cheerful by being something like her own mother, and by running in and out and going to parties as she had done in frocks full of lace. But she was not there any more. "You needn't expect to see him, because 10 to 1 you won't," said Mrs. Medlock, "and you mustn't expect that there'll be people to talk to. You'll have to play about and look after yourself. You'll be told what rooms you can go into and what rooms you're to be kept out of. There's gardens enough, but when you're in the house, don't go wandering and poking about. Mr. Craven won't have it." "I shall not want to go poking about," said sour little Mary, and just as suddenly as she had begun to be rather sorry for Mr. Archibald Craven, she began to cease to be sorry and to think he was unpleasant enough to deserve all that had happened to him. And she turned her face towards the streaming panes of the window of the railway carriage and gazed out at the grey rainstorm, which looked as if it would go on for ever and ever. She watched it so long and steadily that the greyness grew heavier and heavier before her eyes, and she fell asleep. So there you go, that's the end of chapter 2. So does it remind you of any other books? And what do you think of Mr. Craven and also Mrs. Misselthwaite? Do those characters remind you of any other characters from any other books or films? And what do you think is going to happen next? The next chapter is called Across the Moor. Okay, so I'll speak to you again tomorrow. Hope you've had a nice Sunday, and I'll speak to you all soon.